decades, I think we've all learned something about how coral reef conservation needs to integrate aspects of climate change and reef resilience and the social and the economic drivers and components of resource use. So as the last speaker for the last presenter for the Coral Reef Futures, I've given myself the modest task of bringing all these ideas and issues together and presenting a sort of vision or a framework for how we might develop pragmatic conservation policy based on ecological and social resilience to climate change. This project is based on results from what I think is probably the largest field study to date on the impacts of coral bleaching, both to coral reef ecosystems and to the communities that depend on them as well. So anyway, I think I have the right one. No? So in an absurdly simple summary of all the complicated graphs and things that we've seen, climate change is likely to increase the frequency of high-intensity climatic events. These are things like Category 5 cyclones and the warm water events that give rise to coral bleaching. This will, in turn, have profound impacts on sensitive ecosystems like coral reefs and, of course, the communities, the coastal communities around the world that depend on them. Well, one way that scientists and managers have thought about incorporating climate change into conservation policies is by selecting conservation strategies based on a site's susceptibility to the impacts of climate change. Now, what I mean by that is certain sites, well, environmental conditions such as climates, such as currents and upwellings, and biological attributes like we've heard about gene expressions and symbiodiniums in different species and different assemblages are more resilient to coral bleaching. And we've got a good idea of how these work, particularly in the environmental idea. We can create maps of spatial patterns of where the impacts of climate change are likely to be greatest. And we can use these differences to develop locally appropriate conservation strategies. Now, I do want to point out that this doesn't mean we should abandon areas of high susceptibility to climate change, but rather we need to develop strategies that are more appropriate to those conditions. Well, these ideas of incorporating environmental susceptibility are needed and they're laudable, but they often focus solely on the biology or environmental attributes without adequate consideration of the socioeconomic context. This limited focus on sort of ecology and the environmental factors can really undermine the conservation efforts that we try to achieve, because these conservation efforts are really dependent on the capacity of communities to cope with change. And the change can not only be from climate change, but changes in the regulations and the types of management strategies that we propose. This changes the way people use the resources and the relationships with the resources. Now, the common assumption among conservation biologists is that fisheries closures, the green zones and no-take zones that we've heard a lot about, these can benefit fishermen by improving or maintaining catch in adjacent fisheries. And I think we've had a few talks today that really highlighted the mechanisms and how successful these can be at doing those. But these conservation benefits are not necessarily realized by everyone, particularly the segments of the population who are unable to adapt to the changes put forth by these regulations or take advantages of the opportunities created by conservation, opportunities such as tourism. So, dealing with climate change as an issue in coral reef conservation will not only depend on our ability to sort of predict where climate change impacts will be the hardest, but it will also depend on our ability to understand and harness the capacity of coastal communities to manage resources and to cope with and adapt to change. Now, this idea of societies being able to cope with and adapt to change is often called adaptive capacity. And it's a critical component of resilience, of social resilience. And we heard some great talks, particularly yesterday, about how coral reef systems can undergo phase shifts and go from coral-dominated systems into algal-dominated systems. And Dave Bellwood gave some interesting ideas for how batfish may help bring those back into coral-dominated systems. Well, social systems can also undergo these types of phase shifts. The types of marine tenure arrangements that Simon was talking about my PhD research was looking at how those can undergo phase shifts into open access systems, or more like open access systems. And we heard some interesting talks from Gary Russ today about how these open access systems can essentially undergo phase shifts into collective management systems, like we've seen in the Philippines, in Chile, and in Kenya as well. So we've defined adaptive capacity as the ability of households to anticipate and respond to changes in coral reef ecosystems and fisheries, and to minimize, cope with, and recover from the consequences of those change. So we suggest that by plotting the susceptibility to climate change against the social adaptive capacity, right, this will distinguish sites along these gradients. And these present four, I guess, domains or different areas of policy and conservation requirements. So regions with low climate-related susceptibility, these are areas where we want to consider sustainable uses. This may be something like marine protected areas that get some of their funding from tourism revenue, right? Or we may want to look at things like sustainable fisheries. But in this area, differing socioeconomic conditions will really limit the viability of certain approaches. So in this area of high social capacity and low susceptibility to climate change, this is where communities can readily adapt to restrictions, and they can take advantages of opportunities from conservation, things such as tourism. This is where we might have ideas like protected areas funded by, marine protected areas with part of the revenue funded by tourism. But in these areas where adaptive capacity is low, people are poorly equipped to deal with the changes brought out by regulations. This may mean they're unwilling or unable to comply with protection. This is where you see paper parks. This is where those happen. Efforts to implement protected areas in this sort of zone are typically unsuccessful. What this requires is building adaptive capacity, and Simon talked a little bit about some of the steps that we can take to really build this adaptive capacity. Things like poverty alleviation, infrastructure, building social capital, the sort of bonds between communities, or within communities, alternative incomes, all these ideas. Now, once capacity is enhanced, then we'll be able to deal with, the communities will be able to deal with conservation. But until then, things really aren't going to work. But prior to these developments, we can still manage resources there, but we have to do it with management options that have lower social costs. And I guess what I mean by that is there's many ways to skin a cat, right? We heard a lot about the importance of herbivory in maintaining sort of the resilience of a system, but not all fishing effort targets herbivorous fish. There's certain gears that are selective towards herbivorous fish, and certain gears that are not selective towards herbivorous fish. So what you could do in an area like this, you don't need to outlaw all fishing or prohibit all fishing. You might look at restricting only the types of fishing that target herbivorous fish in here. That's going to have less of an impact on the community. Now, up at the top, these are areas with high susceptibility to climate change. This is where you really want to consider development strategies that don't really rely on resources. You don't necessarily want a marine protected area that gets all of its revenue from tourism. In the Mombasa Marine Park, they charge $25 US to go snorkeling for a day. Now, how many of us would on vacation want to spend $25 to dive a rubble field? I mean, no one. It sucks. And so these areas they're going to be continually bleached, if you're using the funds from tourism to support this, it's a bad idea. It's not going to work in the long term. People are not going to support it, and your foundation for conservation will ultimately crumble. But again, of course, the differing socioeconomic conditions are really what's going to determine the proper strategy for each area. Now, I think this is going to be the most interesting area. This is where you want to sort of keep your eyes on. You know, when I think about this region in my mind's eye, I think about sort of the Seychelles, which had like 95% mortality of their corals. Think about that after 4 or 5 more bleaching events, when you've got a fraction of a percent of your sort of coral cover left. You've got nothing to lose. So you're going to want to experiment. You're going to want to innovate and adapt. This is where big transformations of this sort of social ecological system are going to occur. There's going to be societal change and diversification, and we may see active ecosystem engineering through things like food web restoration. And you know, Rocky's talk yesterday sort of, I guess, fascinated me. I I guess I didn't imagine the scale at which modern aquaculture works. Like the idea of releasing tens of millions of Dave Bellwood's batfish to go save a reef, I think is pretty amazing. You know, I mean, the scale at which we could engineer things are pretty amazing these days. This zone, you have nothing to lose, and you're going to be adaptive here. And the adaptations that happen here, these innovations, I think, are going to fuel ideas in other quadrats. So this area where your reefs are very likely to get hammered by bleaching, and you have no capacity to deal with this change. This is where you don't want to be. This is Sucksville. This is where you're looking at human development. You're looking at donor assistance. This is where you're looking at working with the UN and working with the World Bank, decoupling people from the resources. This is a very difficult place, and you're really dealing with disaster risk here. So we had that framework, and we tested this, we sort of operationalized this framework. We work with government partners throughout the Western Indian Ocean, and they wanted us to help understand how the region was prepared for climate change. That region has got 30 million people dependent on reef resources. And as I mentioned, coral reefs in some areas have been extensively damaged. Up to about 95% mortality was reported in the Seychelles. So our first step was to come up with a region-wide model of susceptibility to coral bleaching. And I don't want to go over the methods too much, but we looked at a range of different environmental factors, and we synthesized those into a single map of environmental susceptibility to climate change. And you can see there, the areas in red are the ones that are more susceptible to coral bleaching, and the lighter areas are those that are less susceptible to coral bleaching. Now, my area of expertise, I'm a social scientist, so this was my contribution to it. We measured adaptive capacity by looking at 45 different coastal communities in Kenya, Tanzania, Madagascar, Seychelles, and Mauritius. And we looked at 8 indicators of adaptive capacity. These included things like infrastructure, whether the government had invested in these areas. Gear diversity, you can see the Rasta man there, he's got his fish traps there, which incidentally target herbivorous fish, but does he have any other options? Or is that the only type of gear that he knows, or the only type that he has funds to use? Social capital, occupational multiplicity and mobility. This is the number of types of jobs that people have and their ability to move between these jobs. We looked at things like material assets. Do people have the money to invest in any other sort of livelihood options? We looked at things like their ability to anticipate change and formulate response strategies. And we looked at their recognition of causality. Did they understand that human activities can impact marine resources? So there's our framework again, and let's take a look and see how the different places sort of fall into there. In areas with low susceptibility, you find Mauritius and eastern Madagascar. Mauritius, again, is separated by this high adaptive capacity. This is getting to that area where you might want to sort of protect and preserve the reefs there. And on a regional level, this is where you'd want to invest in protected areas that may be driven by tourism. And in eastern Madagascar, this is where you want to start dealing with some building capacity there. In areas with high bleaching susceptibility, you've got the Seychelles, Kenya, starting to get Tanzania, and interestingly, western Madagascar. So Madagascar is the 4th largest island in the world, and the eastern side has a different susceptibility to the western side. So the spatial scale on this is really variable. It may not, one strategy may not work just because it's the same country. Now, let's take a look. I mean, this looks nice. This is what we think they should be doing, but what are the actual strategies that they're doing there? Does it fit at all with what we think you'd need to do to be prepared? So I put a little table here. It's got the countries down there, and then it's got the total area of coral reefs, the area of that which they've completely protected from fishing in terms of their green zones, and then that as a proportion of their total reef area. So let's take a look at Mauritius. This is where we sort of think you'd want to invest in protected areas, potentially funded by tourism. They've protected 8.5 square kilometers of their reef. That's less than 1%. That's the exact opposite of what we'd like to think would be happening. The Seychelles is interesting. Their reefs, again, hit that 95% mortality. Yet they've had the biggest investment in protected areas in the region. They protected 255 square kilometers, which is 15% of their reefs. We realize that that's still not probably in line with what we think here in Australia is that sort of 33% is probably a good minimum target. But they've got the biggest percent in the region anyway. And Kenya is, again, an interesting case study. This is they're sort of approaching Sucksville, but they've got a medium-sized national marine protected area network that's entirely funded by tourism revenue. This is where you could spend $25 a day to go snorkeling in a relatively crappy marine park. And I don't think that's going to last. I think the sustainability of this sort of protection strategy under the climate change scenarios is very questionable. I don't think it's going to work here. So what we're actually seeing is that the strategies of what we would like to think you need to do to be prepared for climate change are pretty much the exact opposite of what they're pursuing in the region. So the challenge that climate change presents to conservation really requires that we use our resources efficiently and effectively. And we need to figure out which management options are most appropriate to the specific sort of social ecological conditions there. In the Western Indian Ocean, as I mentioned, conservation strategies are pursuing pretty much the exact opposite course. But this could be improved by a regional approach to coral reef management. I think what we really need to work on here is working with this conservation idea, this long-term sort of climate change scenario at a regional scale. We need to get things like the World Bank on board in terms of development assistance. We need to work with big partners and big players and to really change things, to change the way that things are being done there. And I will point out that our model of environmental susceptibility, I realize, is just the environmental part and doesn't include a lot of things like recovery from bleaching, resistance of certain species or assemblages to bleaching. We're working on this. This is all happening. It's part of it's in the pile anyway. We're working with people like Andrew Baker, who's collecting some of the information on the different clades. So it's all in the pipeline anyway. So, well, thanks to everyone that was involved in this. You can see it's a long list of people. And that's it. Thank you.